Good evening. This is a regular meeting of the Princeton Planning Board. It's Thursday, June 1st, 2017, and the opening statement is as follows. Pursuant to Section 13 of the Open Public Meetings Act, adequate notice of the time and place of this meeting has been given by prominently posting the 2017 agenda resolution of the regularly scheduled meetings of the Princeton Planning Board. Such notice has been placed on the official bulletin board at the Princeton Municipal Complex and is to be maintained throughout the year by transmitting a copy of such schedule to the Princeton Packet, Town Topics, The Times, Trentonian, and Comcast Media. A copy has been filed with the Clerk of Princeton on the 2nd day of December 2016. Legal notice on the adoption of said resolution appeared in the December 9, 2016 edition of the Princeton Packet. Would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Cromiller? Here. Ms. Capizzoli? Mr. Cohn?
Here.
Mr. Quinn?
Here.
Ms. Sproul?
Here.
Mr. Tekzarny? Mrs. Trotman? Mrs. Ullman?
Here.
Mrs. Gunning?
Here.
Mr. Williamson? Ms. Wilson?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. All right. Let me just, I don't know whether there's anybody here for the second hearing, but the applicant is going to defer that to June 15th. That's our next regular meeting. Okay. Let's start on the findings of fact and resolution. The first one was Grosso Homes, LLC. This is from April 20th of this year. Any comments, additions, corrections? Anyone? Okay. Hearing none, could I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
It's been moved by Ms. Cromwell, second by, was that Mr. Quinn?
Yes.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. The second item under the resolutions is a request for PSA. This is for Miller, Porter, and Muller, and it's the Hidayah appeal.
Madam Chair,
Yes?
they're having a little trouble picking up on
The microphone.
Sounds like it's working to me.
now.
Okay. This is a request for PSA, Miller, Porter, and Muller. It's the Hidayah appeal in the amount of $15,000. Could I get someone to move approval?
I'll move.
Okay. It's been moved by Ms. Cromwell.
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Ullman. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Now, we have two sets of minutes. The first set is from March 3rd of 2016. You all remember back that far? And were there any additions or corrections? Anyone?
I'll move it.
Okay, it's been moved
Second.
and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Did you, Mr. Porter, did you have? Okay. The second set of minutes is from the regular meeting of February 16th of this year. Any additions, corrections?
Yeah, I'd like to ask about one thing. Under the hearings for 39 random, in the third paragraph, where it says Mrs. Ullman questioned, blah, blah, it says there that Lee mentioned that the prevailing setback was optional. I'm pretty sure that later in that meeting, Lee, you checked and corrected that because you decided that under the ordinance it was not optional. Under the new prevailing setback
If I'm reading it
ordinance.
correctly, it was filed before that ordinance went into effect anyhow, so it wouldn't be optional. It wasn't an option.
I know, you said it wasn't applicable, but that, in any case, it would not be, that it would
Right.
be optional. And
It's
I
not
wouldn't want
optional.
that mistake to enter
Okay.
the historical record.
Okay. Any other additions or corrections? Would somebody like to move those minutes with that?
I'll move it
revision?
with the
With the
change.
correction? Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. And that brings us to our discussion item for this evening. This is a presentation by the Stony Brook Watershed Association, and then we will have a discussion of the ordinance referral on stormwater management, and I believe, Mr. West, you're going to lead that thing. So if invite the Watershed to come forward. Sure.
I'm left-handed. Is that working? Very good. Good evening. My name is Jim Waltman. I'm the Executive Director of the Stony Brook Millstone Watershed Association, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you tonight about stormwater management.
I'm going to ask if you'd be sworn in for the purpose
Certainly.
of this hearing, and whether you swear or affirm to testify truthfully.
I do.
Thank you.
Excuse me, are our monitors working?
Yeah, you need to turn them on. I
Oh.
just turned mine on.
Yeah, no, I just pressed that. I'm not getting it. Here. Oh, see.
There's no, well, it'll come on. There you go.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So stormwater is a very serious issue for us. It's the #1 cause of water pollution in our region, and flooding for that matter. And to show you how seriously we take this issue, I brought some friends tonight. Our policy director, Mike Pissarro, is with us. A brand new staff person. This is a new investment for the watershed. Corey Kreisler, her job is stormwater specialist. We have Tammy Sands, who's with us this summer, interning as an intern focused on the stormwater issue. And of course, we have Sophie Glovier from our board and Scott Sillers from our board, multi-purposing here. What I want to do is lay out some background on the issue, talk a little bit about flooding and water pollution, stormwater strategies that we're promoting in several venues, describe the recommendations we've made to the council about stormwater management, and then give you a brief introduction to some related issues. Despite what you read in the news today, we are living in a world with a changing climate. I got one laugh at a gale. That was my quota for tonight, right? Unfortunately, it's not a laughing matter. We do have a changing climate, and it's impacting the hydrology of this region and the world. A series of slides here were created by Dr. David Robinson. He's the state climatologist and a professor at Rutgers. And what you see is over time, over the last century plus, the average annual precipitation has increased, and quite dramatically in our state, from a little over 44 inches per year to up over 47.5 inches per year. This again is the average annual precipitation, and it's increased nearly 3.5 inches in just about a century's time. What that means for the state of New Jersey is over 500 billion more gallons of water that are falling from the sky onto the land. And much of this water is coming in larger and larger bursts. We all remember what happened just about a year ago. The Princeton region received over 7 inches of rain in a short period of time, and the result was pretty predictable, shutting down transportation and business in our region pretty forcefully. And it wasn't long ago we had a very similar situation with Hurricane Irene, back just 6 years ago now. Again, another 7 inches plus of rain. We know that climatologists have been looking over periods of time. This is a slide prepared by Climate Central, but it projects data and analysis done as part of the National Climate Assessment. And what they've seen is every region of the United States has had an increase in the number of heavy downpours. Specifically, this shows the percent of rain falling in the heaviest rain events that have increased. And in the Northeast, you see it's quite dramatic, 71% just between 1958 and 2012. The other thing we know as important context for this discussion is that development continues to creep across the landscape. shown in red on the map to the left, shows the increase in development across the state of New Jersey between 1972 and 2010. And much of that red is being covered by impervious surfaces like asphalt, concrete, rooftops, and so forth that are impervious to water. In our region alone, in the Millstone Watershed, within which the town of Princeton sits, between 1995 and 2012, these impervious surfaces increased by more than 30%, just in a pretty brief period of time, less than 2 decades. In Princeton, the creep of impervious cover has been a little bit slower. It's because the town is relatively developed compared to some other parts of the state. But you see even there in that period of time, about a 2% increase in impervious surfaces, a larger increase than that in developed surfaces. So as we convert woods and fields into developments, within those new developments, a lot of the land is actually impervious to the to rain and snowmelt. We say the water cycle, in fact, has been quite dramatically altered. And we can take a look at what a natural watershed does. And about 50% of the precipitation in such a watershed will infiltrate, it'll percolate down into the ground. 10% will run off the surface, and the remainder will transpire or evapotranspire back into the atmosphere. When we start adding impervious surfaces, you see a reduction in infiltration and an increase in runoff. So in a town like Princeton, where much of the areas are about 10 to 20% impervious surfaces, you see the amount of water that runs off the surface has doubled. And as you continue to add surface in areas like downtown Princeton, you see that percentage is changed even more dramatically, ultimately very little percolating, infiltrating into the ground, and more of the water running off. So as the saying goes, this is not rocket science. We're seeing more precipitation, more lot coverage with impervious surfaces, and the remainder is more water, higher volumes in our streams, eroding, tearing up our streams like at Brook, and downstream ultimately a lot more flooding, such as in the town of Manville, which is basically the end receiver of stormwater runoff from 25 towns in the Millstone watershed, and several dozen towns from the Raritan watershed. I'm going to pivot over to the second issue, which is water pollution. Fortunately, we don't see this problem that was so dramatic 40, 50 years ago. The just direct discharge of industrial pollutants and raw sewage that we saw back then doesn't happen for the most part. It's highly regulated. But that's not to say that our water is clean. In fact, in the state of New Jersey, most of the waters that have been monitored are failing to meet all of the standards. The number is well over 90%, unfortunately, of the streams that are measured don't meet all of our standards. And that is mostly because of polluted stormwater runoff. It's really quite a witch's brew of things that are the byproduct of our daily lives. We call these non-point sources of pollution or people pollution. It's all the junk that runs off the surfaces of our lawns, our parking lots, our roadways, etc. And you see as a result, in the town of Princeton, the streams are failing to meet all of the standards. The aquatic life is suffering. E. coli is higher than it should be, and phosphorus is well above what the standards show. So the nation, the state, and you have attempted to address these serious problems. We have the Federal Clean Water Act, which passed 45 years ago, and it set some very big, broad, bold goals, one of which was to eliminate discharges of pollutants by 1985. We didn't meet that goal, but we've got tools at our disposal to try to do a better job of getting there. For stormwater management in particular, the law sets the municipalities up as a key actor. And in the state, our body of laws and regulations actually authorize municipalities to go above and beyond federal and state standards, in fact, to adopt more protective stormwater ordinances than those minimum standards. And that's why we're excited to be before you tonight. Stepping back a little bit, let's think about how we used to talk about and plan for stormwater management. The old way of thinking was to try to get water off our properties as quickly as possible. Put them down storm drains into pipes and get them out to a stream, to a river, out to sea as quickly as possible. That had some obvious downsides. The folks that live downstream from us suffer the consequences from increased flooding. The pollutants that are, again, on our lawns, our roadways, and what have you, attach themselves to the stormwater as it rushes by, causing water pollution. And when we stop the percolation of water down into the ground, we're not only causing more flooding, we're also starving the groundwater of recharge. So we've got these triple impacts of stormwater and the old way of dealing with it. The new way of thinking about stormwater management is quite different. And the goal here is to try to take that water, address it on site, infiltrate it when we can down into the soil, down into the ground, or at least hold on to it for a while and release it after the peak of the storm has come and gone. So you see things like rain gardens, rain cisterns, or as in this photo, a rain bladder that fits under a deck, and vegetated swales. Again, these are all measures to try to address stormwater in this new way of thinking, and it has the flip side, 3 benefits to address the 3 problems caused in the last slide: reducing flooding, reducing water pollution, and recharging our aquifers. My favorite example of this approach was incorporated into the Watershed's new LEED Platinum Center over in Hopewell. The entry pavilion into the building has a roof of about 2,500 square feet. That water is all released through a spout that you can see here kind of in the middle of the building. And so all of the precipitation on that 2,500 square feet is directed at a rain garden that's a little less than half the size. What's interesting about this, and we didn't plan it this way, but the rain garden, in fact, was constructed at the precise area of maximum impaction of the construction. So the area where the cranes went and most of the heavy machinery went on our site were able to be restored, revived, and turned into this beautiful rain garden that has functioned so well for us. Here's another photograph of it. This is Corey Kreisiter, our new stormwater specialist, measuring the amount of water in the rain garden. So a few weeks ago, we got about 2 inches of rain in our area. So that's about 3,500 gallons of water that came off our rooftop. And that was all infiltrated within 48 hours. None of it ran off the site. So this rain garden is working quite well at our building. Now, shifting to the state regulations, in 2004, the state adopted some quite aggressive regulations. 3 goals. This is pretty repetitive, right? We're trying to reduce flood damage, maintain groundwater recharge, and address this non-point source pollution problem. The new stormwater rules get at this mainly by regulating what are called major developments. So New Jersey's municipalities must adopt stormwater ordinances that address these major developments defined as developments that disturb 1 or more acres of land. It's almost 44,000 square feet. And or add a 1/4 acre of impervious cover, a little under 11,000 square feet. And there are a number of things that a developer must do to address the stormwater coming from such a development. Retaining groundwater recharge, reducing the peak flows off the site, reducing the suspended solids. And the last bullet is to the maximum extent practicable, use non-structural strategies. We're trying to use the landscape, the natural features in our communities to address stormwater management. These rules and the town ordinances that implement it have done a very good job at slowing the rate at which the problem is getting worse. Okay? So that's a start, but it only addresses large developments in the state regulations, and the program is not addressing existing stormwater problems from existing developments. There's a program within the Clean Water Act that's kind of a twin for stormwater management called Total Maximum Daily Loads. So in Section 303D of the law, it requires states to regularly monitor their waters, and when they identify waterways that are impaired, i.e. they are not meeting the standards, they need to put together a pollution budget. Basically figure out how much pollution you can put in the stream and have it still meet the water quality standards, and then you have to allocate how much pollution to the various users and the various polluters. So it's basically a plan to clean up the water by allocating the waste loads. Okay. In our area, the New Jersey DEP proposed and the US EPA approved one of these TMDLs for phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, pH, and total suspended solids in that region called the Raritan Basin. The Millstone Watershed is part of the Raritan Basin. Harry's Brook is part of the Millstone Basin. So this TMDL includes Princeton. Now, your job is to determine what the whether or not the ordinance that the governing body has proposed is consistent with your master plan. And we, no surprise, we think it very much is consistent. Your master plan has a very nice conservation element with several goals. Those goals include very explicitly protecting the groundwater and surface water to safeguard drinking water supply, recreation, and natural habitats. Very clearly, you're reviewing site plans to minimize environmental disruption, encourage landscaping consistent with the above goals. So in our minds, the action that's being proposed here is quite consistent with the town's master plan. Now, the Watershed Association made a number of recommendations to the governing body back in January. There's 7 bulleted ones here, reducing the threshold for that definition of major development to capture smaller developments, creating a brand new category that we call minor developments, and requiring those smaller developments to address their stormwater impacts. We recommended requiring action on redevelopment projects. So when someone's going back to rebuild an existing structure, they should have to address the stormwater ramifications of that original building that skirted through without addressing stormwater. Requiring maintenance, inspection, and reporting on these stormwater systems. After all, we put them in the ground. We want to make sure they're functioning and doing their job. Only allowing waivers from your stormwater rules when there's some kind of mitigation for that waiver, such as through a fee. Emphasizing the non-structural techniques and green infrastructure, and then making sure that your stormwater program is aligned with the TMDL. Okay, so how do we do? We are here tonight to strongly endorse the proposed ordinance that's been introduced at the governing board and urge you to do likewise. The proposed ordinance does lower the threshold for a major development as basically cutting it in half. It does create a new minor development category, not quite as low as we had recommended, but still quite aggressive, down to a 400 square foot threshold, and it requires 2 gallons of stormwater be mitigated for every square foot of new impervious surface. Essentially, that addresses the 2-year storm, about 3.3 inches of precipitation. The ordinance does not address redevelopment, but the staff and council have agreed to continue working with us, and we hope we'll have a phase 2 go at this when we've done some more research to address those issues. It does require inspection of stormwater features. It limits that just to the major developments, the larger developments, and just an annual inspection. It's another issue we'd like to continue working with the town on. There's no provision of an ordinance, but again, we've got time to work on that. And we're pleased that it does, in fact, emphasize green infrastructure and align your stormwater program with the TMDL. So I will admit that we are a tough grader, but the Princeton ordinance that's been proposed in our minds is quite strong and bold and deserving to be advanced. Now, there are a lot of different ways, and we spent time talking to your staff and council members, that this can be implemented. A homeowner or smaller business with one of these minimum or minor developments can choose to install a rain garden like this one in Princeton, which is working quite well even before the vegetation has really taken hold. And depending on the soil types and how much you amend the soil, you see the range of sizes of a rain garden that would be adequate to address the stormwater. So 500 square foot addition. In good soils, you're talking about a 10 by 10 rain garden. In tougher soils, twice as large as that. And then you can look at the costs below that. Worst case, we're talking about maybe $5 per square foot of development that you're adding to the cost of the development that you're building. Okay? People I know in Princeton spend a lot more than $5 a square foot of new construction. Another way to address this is through storage, through cisterns below or above ground. Again, these systems can run $600 or more for a 500-gallon tank, so that would scale up. That bladder at the bottom come in models that hold thousands and thousands of gallons. You see these are not free. There's some cost, but relative to the cost borne by all of Princeton's residents by flooding and water pollution, we think this is a quite reasonable amount of cost. Other models of the same kinds of design, some of them look a little different. You can get some that look a little bit like a brick wall, for example, at the bottom. You would not be the first town in New Jersey to adopt more aggressive standards than the state's minimum. These are just a smattering of towns around the state that have done so. These towns address the minor developments in their ordinances. Examples of some triggers: one town goes as low as 200 square feet, 500 square feet, 1,000 square feet. So quite a few examples where towns are being more aggressive than what the state requires. These are examples of what are required for the treatment. And I'll just say that what you're looking at here is very consistent with what some of these other towns have done. A second strategy, I want to just take a breath and say that we're also working in your community and others to try to do some stormwater management projects that aren't necessarily required by any mitigation for a development, but just can be incorporated within the town to address these problems. The TMDL that was adopted in 2016 has given us an opportunity to do some of this work. So a couple years ago, the Watershed and Rutgers University kind of in concert put in and received large grants from DEP to do some planning. So we are looking, the Watershed is looking at Princeton and 15 other towns to identify areas with large pieces of impervious surface, and we're developing plans on ways that that could be mitigated. We will have some funds to actually then implement plans where there are landowners who are willing to have us do that work. And there are just an incredibly exciting array of strategies that are out there now being implemented for addressing stormwater. I hadn't seen this until Corey discovered this pervious pavement that goes down. You can see in that picture that truck is laying that thing down. The little areas between the blocks are the pervious part. It's strong enough to hold quite a heavy truck. And the beauty of that is when it comes time to fix the pipes under the ground, you don't have to dig the ground up. You don't have to dig and repave the street. You lift the street up, you fix the pipe, and you put the street back down. A number of towns are putting little pockets of green stormwater infrastructure along their streets, streetscaping with strategies that make the town more beautiful and also address their flooding and water pollution problems. And of course, there are rain gardens that are proliferating like madness in a bunch of municipalities and businesses across the region. These here, Capitol Health over in Hopewell, a rain garden down in a Camden municipal facility, and Hillsborough's municipal building just up 206 from us. So thank you very much for your attention and your patience and your interest in addressing this issue.
Thank you. Will you take some questions from the board? Anyone have anything you'd like to ask?
You talked about, and I see from some of your visuals, the phosphorus is a big problem here. What are the typical contributors to that? Is that fertilizer? Is that...
So it's really any number of things. Fertilizer has been a large part of the problem. Now the state adopted a new fertilizer law that you may know about a few years ago, and that's just starting to kick in a real way. That dramatically reduces the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen, for that matter, that's included in fertilizers. Got it on the third try. So that should do that should help. But wastewater treatment, so both failing septic systems can be a big problem. Cracked sewer pipes that do happen can add it to it. I went to a presentation last month where a guy was looking at phosphorus coming off of parking lots in suburban areas, and the effluent from parking lots themselves were loaded with phosphorus. Not exactly sure how that's happening. So there's airborne phosphorus that can form or land on parking lots and then get rushed off. So there's any number of problems here. The best way to treat it is through plants and wetland plants and plants that thrive in rain gardens. In fact, we have at our center, the way we treat our wastewater is to pump the water through a series of constructed wetlands, because the more typical way of doing waste treatment over in Hopewell is these large septic systems, and those don't do a good job of getting the phosphorus out, but these wetlands do. So that's we're kind of going back to nature to address these big problems today.
Thank you. This was a great presentation. I'm really grateful that you put so much time and work into helping the town grapple with all of this stuff, and I'm a huge booster of green infrastructure, as people are already tired of hearing me talk about it, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. The slide you had about the above groundwater, under groundwater, under/above groundwater storage tanks.
Sure.
What do we do with that water eventually that's stored?
Right. Excellent question. So the problem is all the water comes at once, and it just overwhelms the landscape, right? What these do is allow you to hold on to that water, and then you can release it. You can either hold on to it and use it to irrigate your garden, for example, or you can just hold on to it and then let it go over time after the rain stops. So some of these are built with holes in the bottom. They're perforated, and they hold the water, and then they release it. Some of them, people want to hold on to all that water, and they have huge gardens that then they can water with it.
I guess especially when we run into those situations like in California where you have low rainfall or whatever, and then say you got to restrict watering the garden and that type of thing. Okay, thanks.
Yep, exactly. Thank you.
Jack?
Just on a follow-up to that, we actually do have a resident now that has one of those systems where they use it for the gray water to flush the toilets in the house. So they're actually going a step beyond just using it for irrigation.
And if I can brag a little bit more about our new building, we do that as well. So the water, it's a pretty simple system. We have a 1,200-gallon cistern that captures water from the west-facing roof, goes down into the cistern, and then there's a pump that sends that water to the restrooms to flush the toilet. So it's new. Finding a plumber that knows how to put it together the right way can be a bit of a challenge, or it was for us. But it's the future, and it's here, and it's exciting. Yeah.
David?
Just a question about the mitigation fees.
Yeah.
So those fees would hopefully go towards like the TMDL projects that you're doing. That's what it's imagined being used for?
Exactly. So under the current stormwater rules of the state, towns are encouraged to create mitigation plans, and they are to be funded through these situations where you may choose to issue a waiver. What we're suggesting is that you actually make that very explicit. We need to do a little bit more work and talk to other towns and parts of the country where they're doing this. I was just at a conference in Michigan, and they're making heavy use of this. And the idea is that you can actually do a better job for stormwater doing a few large projects rather than lots of little bitty projects. And the way they do the large projects is to gather these mitigation fees from smaller developments, and then they can really make a big bang. The projects that we're coming up with, and we'll be talking to the town with you. We don't intend to bring you a book and say, here, do all of these things. We want to work closely with you. But the idea is that we would then have plans, and then as funds become available through the state, or if you started a mitigation program, those could actually be implemented to start addressing the problem. I mean, we've spent a lot of time looking over, for example, at the shopping center parking lot. And if you've ever crawled down to the park below it and looked at the massive pipes down there, the water that's collected in the parking lot is all going over to that neighborhood, resulting, at least in part, in the flooding that you see in the Meadowbrook area. So there are things that you can do in built environments like that. There are things you can put along your streets. There's pretty extraordinary strategies that are out there in a lot of different parts of the country, and I think Princeton has a lot of room to step into that and be real leaders.
Okay. Anyone else?
I mean, I have a couple of questions, but I think they're more for Jack and Lee. Yeah, for the ordinance.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you again.
Mr. West, I think you're on.
Okay, so now that you have the background, what we have is the ordinance. And actually, Princeton was a little bit ahead of the curve, where we didn't call it a minor development. We didn't call it a minor development.
Jack,
Oh,
I'm going to swear you and Lee in to the extent that you provide testimony. Do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully?
I do.
Lee? Thank you.
So in the former township, what they had was Table 10B 246.1. It's called Table A. And it had two columns. The first column was the minimum threshold for requiring stormwater management on a site. So if you were below that percentage and you did not impact the neighboring property, and that was kind of at the discretion of the municipal engineer, you didn't have to provide stormwater management. They also had a 500 square foot threshold that was in that calculation also. The second column was the maximum impervious coverage you could have on the site. So there was discretion from the engineer as to whether if you were under that column A, that you didn't have to provide stormwater management. Borough was a lot simpler. They just had, if you exceeded 400 square feet of new impervious, you had to provide stormwater management on site. So when we started doing this, we started with using the townships as a model and working with PEC and Stony Brook, Millstone. We wanted to eliminate the discretion part of it. So what we have is we use the 400. They had recommended 250. Council thought that 400 was a more reasonable number. So basically what happens, if you exceed 400 square feet, you have to provide 2 gallons of storage for every 1 square foot of new impervious. The reason we did that was part of the problem a lot of applicants had, especially homeowners, is to do stormwater calculations, you had to hire an engineer. That could cost several $1,000s. So we wanted to simplify the system, so we just came up with that recommendation from Millstone as using the 2-to-1. What we went a step further, because with doing that, you also have to prove that the overflow from the system is not going to impact an adjacent property. Because the concern is, even if you're storing that 800 gallons or whatever it is, that fills up very fast, especially when you have an inch or two of rain. So we have a provision that you have to show that you're not impacting a neighbor, whether you pipe it, whether it's going into a stream, wetlands, a swale, drains to the street. As long as you're not impacting your neighbor, you use the 2-to-1. If there is no way to get it to a street or it will impact the neighbor, then we came up with you have to use a 3-to-1 ratio. So we thought that was a way to address some of those issues. The next area is major development. And as Jim indicated, the current threshold was 1 acre or a 1/4 acre of new impervious. And basically we agreed and we cut that in half. So a major development is now classified as a 1/2 acre of disturbance and 5,000 square feet of new impervious. The next area, the third area that we changed was the definition of impervious surface. And in the borough and township had 2 different definitions. Actually, in the township had two different definitions in different parts of the ordinance. So what we did was we actually went with the borough's definition, which basically included, obviously roofs, pavement, sidewalks. In the borough included decks as impervious, and porous pavement as impervious. Then what we did, we added that pools would also be considered impervious. And that's trying to be consistent and to be conservative. The issue is trying to limit how much development can go on a site. So that's our definition of impervious. And then the fourth and final area of change to the ordinance is requiring a yearly permit. Any major development in the last 20 years or thereabouts was required to provide a maintenance plan for your stormwater basin. So there is maintenance required on all these basins or porous pavement. Whatever you have, there is maintenance required. So this requires that you obtain this permit yearly. It's a cost of $50. And with the submittal, you have to show that you've maintained. You have to submit a report saying that, yes, I did have somebody come in and maintain my stormwater management system. So that's getting the process started. In this ordinance, we limited it only to major developments. One thing we're looking into, maybe in phase 2, is including all single-family homes that have a rain garden or a dry well, that ultimately they would have to do this permit also to prove that it's being maintained. One of the concerns, especially porous pavement is a big issue that people like it, but it has to be vacuumed 4 times a year. So somebody using it for a driveway in their house, bringing a company in to come and vacuum your driveway 4 times a year, is going to be, I think it's going to be onerous, and the concern is that it may be problematic. So we want to make sure that's why we're considering the porous pavement as impervious, to try to control it. Essentially, those are really the 4 major changes in the ordinance. Everything else, we basically used the township ordinance as kind of the base. Obviously took out all the references to township or borough. But essentially, those are the 4 major changes.
So, did you want to walk through the ordinance with, or now we've at least had an overview of what the points that makes are, or did you just want to ask questions about it?
Well, I mean, I've read it, but if other people haven't, maybe should walk through it. I mean, that was sort of what Jack was just doing, right? We were
Right,
supposed
it
to be
was just
walking through it, so.
Well, just for efficiency, maybe maybe people are just ready to approve it?
Well, I have some questions.
You do?
I
Okay.
think,
Yeah.
I think there are questions.
Okay, I just was trying to,
Okay.
So the first question is, in the section about providing 2 or 3 gallons of storage on site per square foot of development, I would like to think that we could give the option to engineer the system as an alternative, because I can imagine if there was a really large project that started to call for thousands of gallons of storage, that the homeowner might actually be well served to hire an engineer and provide an actual stormwater system that might include, surface infiltration and stuff like that that could reduce the actual cost of the storage system. Is that something that was considered?
No, because if you engineer the system, you can't use infiltration as a way to reduce the volume. You don't get credit for the rate of infiltration on a stormwater system.
I think that, if you've got X numbers of feet of runoff distance, that there is some infiltration.
No, you have to provide infiltration, but you can't use it as a method to reduce the volume of storage. It's being conservative.
Can we swear you in if you're going to say something?
Certainly. Would you give your name and title?
My name is Mike Pissarro. It's P-I-S-A-U-R-O. I'm the policy director for the Stony Brook Millstone Watershed Association.
And do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully?
I do swear. Mr. Cohen, I think the question really with the 2 gallons is doing with the minor. Once you start getting to thousands of gallons, you're really in sort of the major development aspects.
Well, but if it's a residential, it's a large house, you could get into that size of a system without triggering the major requirement.
No, once you exceed 5,000 square feet of new impervious, so if you're doing a large house with tennis courts, you're going to be into a major development regardless.
So you'd be doing the engineering anyway.
All right, so fine.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
But David, what I was trying to explain, if it's raining at 2 inches an hour and the ground will infiltrate 1 inch an hour, you don't get to subtract that 1 inch from the amount of rain coming down to reduce the volume. You still have to store that volume of all the rain coming down. Even though some of it's perking into the ground, when you're doing the calculations, you don't get credit for that.
I'm not an expert, so, I mean, some of the articles that I've read about green stormwater management suggest that that's actually a preferred strategy, rather than putting it in holding tanks, but maybe I didn't understand it.
But it's not put out by New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection.
Okay. The second question I had is about agreement between what's in your memo versus what's in the ordinance, because I think specifically the definition of impervious coverage, your memo says that decks and porous pavement will be considered impervious. Yeah. But when I looked at the language in the ordinance, and it's a section 10B241 in the definitions, I guess there's a definition of impervious surface, and it says that impervious surfaces that are semi-porous or disconnected from a runoff conveyance system by intervening pervious areas shall have an effective surface area equal to 75% of their actual area. So it seems like there's some credit.
That's all coming out.
Oh, the part in brackets?
Yes.
Okay. And so similarly, wood decks and above ground and below ground swimming pools, also that's coming out. So all of that.
The pools and decks are in as being considered impervious.
Impervious.
Yes.
So, okay. So the last question I have is about these porous pavement systems. And, I have heard, although the instructions from the manufacturer may call for them to be vacuumed 4 times a year, in practice, what I've heard from people who've used these porous paving systems is that they never have failed, after 10 years of never being vacuumed. And so I'm curious whether you're basing your caution on actual data that's showing failure of these systems, or, is it just, well, that's what the manufacturer says, and we don't trust people to do it? It's
based on the DEP BMP manual that recommends they be vacuumed 4 times a year. Now, I know we have several areas of porous pavement in town now. I know it's not being vacuumed 4 times a year, and I'm not aware of any that's failed, so it's probably conservative.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like something we would want to encourage. If a developer is going to be paving their parking lot and they don't get any credit for doing porous pavement, then they're not going to do porous pavement. And yet, it's, again, in the green building community, it's generally considered environmentally preferable approach.
They do get credit for porous pavement. It's considered impervious in the calculation and in the coverage of the lot, but it's used as a method to provide stormwater management on your site. So as opposed to losing acreage to do a standard above-ground detention basin, it's a method to provide it on site. You also get credit for water quality and total suspended solids removal with porous pavement. So there's a lot of benefits that you get out of using it. It's just we're saying we don't want to give you credit for coverage, because theoretically if somebody's building a house and they say, I'm going to pave my whole front yard for parking in porous pavement, I don't have to count it as pervious pavement, as being pervious. So we're actually encouraging people to put more parking and more development on a site and losing either lawn or trees. So it's really trying to limit the amount of development that occurs on a site. You do get credit for it, but also when you do the calculations, you know, that standard practice is that it's considered impervious.
Okay. What about the systems like the one that was in the presentation with those separated blocks? Is that also...
That would be considered porous pavement, the same
so
scenario.
There's no credit for
Right.
that in terms of not being impervious?
Okay.
We've talked about that is giving, you know, do you give, you know, 75% or 20, a credit for that? And that's something we can pursue, and you know, as we talked about, there will be a phase 2 to this. So we may want to look into giving credit for using those porous systems.
Louise?
I want to start by saying I strongly support this ordinance, and as some members of the board may know, I've had a sidebar conversation with Mr. West beforehand about porous pavement and the fact that it's included in the definition specifically as impervious cover. And I think that in the next round of updates, some clarifying language that identifies it as, you know, counting for lot coverage, but not considered impervious. I mean, I think that can be wordsmithed in a way that where you don't have the impact that this ordinance protects against, where people could, if it's considered impervious for purposes of lot coverage, cover the entire lot with pavement.
Yeah.
But I fundamentally absolutely agreeing with you, David, and I also know that most, and I don't know this from personal experience, I know it from talking to a lot of design professionals, people at Rutgers and others that have built with permeable pavement. It manages a gigantic amount of stormwater. It is a hugely effective, yes, green infrastructure, even though it doesn't have vegetation, practice. So it's a great thing to encourage, especially when we get around to drawing in, hopefully in phase 2, redevelopment. And that'll be a particularly important feature of that. And in terms of maintenance, a great many permeable pavement / porous asphalt installations require virtually no vacuuming, but if there's a source of silt or sand, it may very well need to be vacuumed, usually no more than once a year. So DEP, as is its wont, is being extremely conservative, and that's, I got no problem with that, that's their job. But it is not an onerous kind of thing, and that brings me to one other question I had about this. do people who have green infrastructure installations, whether it's permeable pavement or rain garden or whatever, do they have to show that they've paid somebody to maintain it, or do they just have to attest to the fact that it's working? Because you shouldn't have to have somebody come and vacuum if that strip of porous pavement toward the end of your driveway is continuing to accept and manage all of the runoff from your driveway, or if you yourself go out and, sweep the brush off of the little manufactured treatment device that's next to your rain garden. I mean, it just doesn't seem like we should be asking people to prove they paid somebody to do it. So maybe I misunderstood, but I'd like to...
There's two parts to that. One is, first of all, in this ordinance, it's only required for major developments. So it's going to be really the commercial properties or the institutions. And the issue is, do you have to pay somebody? No. But you have to show that you've maintained it. And there'll be periodic inspections.
Yeah.
But I mean, you have to send us a letter, say, yes, I weeded my rain garden, or I vacuumed my porous pavement, or whatever the case may be.
Good.
I just have one more comment, not a question, but in regards to the redevelopment piece of the ordinance, I would love to see that move forward ASAP. I mean, this is a fantastic opportunity. The whole town is really concerned about teardowns. This is a real way to discourage teardowns, because if you think about it, if someone does a little bit, a second-story addition to an existing house or a little addition, they're going to have a much less onerous requirement for stormwater than if they tear down the house and build a new one. And so, I mean, not only for that reason, because I also think that's where the biggest opportunity lies in a developed town like ours, where there aren't that many new projects, where we can really make a lot of difference with stormwater management, is requiring it on redevelopment projects, but also because of the tear downs. So I think I would love to see that move ASAP.
So the reason I asked for that to be in phase 2 and not phase 1 is I was trying to get this done because I believe that when you do the redevelopment, you're going to have some challenges from some of the larger, the institutions. I mean, Avalon Bay would have been a good example. They showed that they actually had a reduction in impervious coverage, but it was a complete tear down. So with the redevelopment ordinance, they would have had to provide the complete stormwater management. Mm-hmm. So my concern is getting legal challenges. Not against it, but I wanted to at least get this ordinance through.
I would like to attest that I've heard DEP officials in charge of this stuff say that they support towns going above and beyond, and specifically including redevelopment as well as development.
No, and I've heard that also.
So,
however, I'm not aware of any towns in New Jersey that have done it yet.
Yeah, cities are doing it. I don't know about smaller towns.
Public hearing? Right. Anybody else? Okay. Why don't I at least open the meeting for a public hearing, and is there anybody out there who'd like to speak to this? Okay. Would you give your name and be sworn in?
Yes, Sophie Glovier, 68 Drake's Corner Road. I'm here representing the Environmental Commission. I serve as chair, and I don't want to prolong the meeting. You've already heard a lot. I just want you to know we've been working on this since last summer. I want to thank the staff and the Watershed, and we strongly endorse this. We believe it's consistent with the master plan. It's good for our local environment, and we hope that you will support it too.
Thank you. Anyone else? No? Okay, if there's no one else, let me close the public portion, and if there are no more questions.
I'll make a motion to approve the ordinance.
Okay, it's been moved. Is there a second?
Or to say it's consistent.
Yes.
Yeah, it's consistent with the
Find it
master plan
consistent.
and recommend its approval by governing body.
Second. the motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. If there are no further discussion or questions, do you want to call the roll on that, please?
Ms. Crummiller?
Yes.
Mr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mr. Quinn?
Yes.
Ms. Sproul?
Yes.
Mrs. Ullman?
Yes?
Mrs. Gunning?
Yes?
Mr. Williamson?
Yes.
Ms. Wilson?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all very much. And thank you, Mr. West, for all your efforts for this. Really appreciate it. Everyone.
We're coming back on the sign?
Since we don't have Mildred, do you want to make a motion?
I will move for adjournment.
I'll second.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded. Should we adjourn?
Yes, second.
Aye.
Did somebody move to adjourn? Yes. I thought